The Geiger counter's frantic clicking cut through mountain silence like machine gun fire. This remote Appalachian Valley shouldn't register anything above background radiation, yet the needle pegged into the danger zone with each step toward the abandoned homestead, where smoke still curled from a chimney that had no right to be burning. What happened in these mountains during the 1950s represents one of America's most deliberately buried secrets, a nuclear disaster so catastrophic that the government spent decades erasing it from official records. Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her hazmat suit's face shield, watching her radiation detector spike to levels that should have been impossible this far from any known test site. The morning mist clung to ridgelines like radioactive fog, while beneath her boots, the soil registered readings that made Chernobyl look like a weekend camping trip. The expedition had started 3 days earlier in Washington, where declassified documents from the Atomic Energy Commission revealed cryptic references to Operation Thunderhead and an unfortunate miscalculation in the Eastern Testing Corridor. Military files from 1953 mentioned a total evacuation protocol implemented in an unnamed Appalachian region, followed by a 70-year classification order that wouldn't expire until 2023. But someone had already broken that silence. Local park rangers reported strange sightings near the West Virginia-Virginia border. Hunters described finding deer with extra limbs, their antlers twisted into impossible spirals. A geological survey team detected radiation signatures that defied explanation, emanating from what satellite imagery showed as an empty valley surrounded by government-owned forest land. When the EPA quietly dispatched a preliminary investigation team in March, only one member returned, babbling about the pale people and eyes that glowed in the dark before suffering a complete nervous breakdown. Chen's team represented the first official attempt to document what Operation Thunderhead had left behind. The valley stretched below them like a wound in the earth, its center marked by what appeared to be a massive crater filled with black glass. But it was the structures surrounding that crater that defied explanation, buildings that seemed to melt and flow like candle wax, their surfaces still radiating heat decades after whatever had created them. The sound of children laughing drifted up from the valley floor. Before we descend into this radioactive nightmare, tell us where you're watching from right now and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop a comment below, and if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we discovered in that valley will change everything you thought you knew about nuclear testing on American soil. Chen checked her dosimeter again, its digital readout climbing steadily as they approached the valley's rim. According to her calculations, anything living down there should have died within hours of the initial contamination. Yet the smoke from that chimney told a different story, one written in mutations, madness, and the kind of government cover-up that turns entire communities into ghost stories. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by something that sounded almost like singing, if singing could carry notes that made your bones ache and your vision blur. Chen's team leader, Dr. Marcus Webb, raised his hand for silence, but the damage was done. They'd been heard, seen, detected by whatever called this Poison Valley home. And now those somethings were climbing toward them through the radioactive mist, moving with a purpose that suggested they'd been waiting for visitors for a very long time. The classified files paint 1953 in stark bureaucratic language, but they can't capture the terror that must have gripped Atomic Energy Commission officials when they realized their controlled detonation had gone catastrophically wrong. The government's first mistake wasn't the explosion itself. It was believing they could contain what came after. Operation Thunderhead was supposed to be a routine test of a new tactical nuclear device designed for battlefield deployment against Soviet forces in mountainous terrain. The remote Appalachian location offered perfect conditions: isolated valleys, sparse population, and terrain that mirrored potential European battlefields. What the planners didn't account for was the unique geological composition beneath Mount Screamer, where limestone caves and underground rivers had created a natural amplification chamber. From a declassified AEC memo dated September 15, 1953, device yield exceeded calculations by factor of 12. Containment failure complete. Recommend immediate population evacuation within 50-mile radius. Situation critical. The blast, intended as a 5-kiloton demonstration, had somehow triggered a chain reaction in the mountain's mineral deposits. Uranium traces in the rock, left over from ancient geological processes, transformed the entire valley into an accidental nuclear reactor. The explosion that was supposed to last milliseconds continued burning for 3 days, its radioactive fire, fed by elements no one knew existed in those quantities, beneath the Appalachian soil. Emergency evacuations began within hours. Military convoys rolled through mountain communities, giving families 30 minutes to pack essential belongings before buses carried them to temporary camps in neighboring states. Most went willingly, understanding that their government was trying to protect them from an invisible enemy that could kill without warning or mercy. Most, but not all, the Henley clan had lived in Deadfall Hollow for 7 generations. Their patriarch, Samuel Henley, claiming his family's right to the land, stretched back to a colonial land grant signed by King George himself. When soldiers arrived at the isolated homestead on September 18th, they found the family barricaded behind hand-built fortifications. Samuel's hunting rifle trained on the lead vehicle, while his wife Rebecca stood beside him with their 6 children, arrayed like steps on a staircase. "This is our land," Samuel had reportedly told Captain James Morrison of the 82nd Airborne. "We were born here, we'll die here, and no government man with a fancy badge is going to tell us different." The standoff lasted 6 hours, during which radiation levels in the immediate area climbed to levels that should have killed everyone involved. Yet the Henleys showed no signs of sickness, no symptoms of the radiation poisoning that was already claiming lives among the cleanup crews working just miles away. Captain Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than force the family from their contaminated homestead, he withdrew his troops and marked the location as evacuated. On official reports, sometimes the cover-up is worse than the crime. What happened to the Henleys after that September day remained classified for 70 years, but the periodic reconnaissance flights told a story that defied both scientific understanding and human imagination. The family not only survived in their radioactive hollow, they thrived, multiplied, changed in ways that challenged every assumption about radiation's effects on human biology. Yet something was climbing toward Chen's team through the morning mist, something that had learned their language from decades of watching, waiting, and evolving in an environment that should have been uninhabitable to any form of life. The singing grew louder, closer, accompanied by the sound of footsteps that didn't quite match the rhythm of normal human movement. The first aerial reconnaissance photos from October 1953 show the Henley homestead as a cluster of dark rectangles against radioactive soil, but it's the details that make trained photo analysts reach for stronger coffee. Smoke rises from multiple chimneys, despite temperatures that should melt lead, and strange geometric patterns radiate outward from the buildings, like crop circles drawn in ash and bone. This wasn't just a family refusing evacuation, this was evolution in fast forward, driven by radiation levels that transformed DNA faster than natural selection ever could. Samuel Henley's decision to stay had condemned his bloodline to become something unprecedented in human history, yet the monthly flyovers suggested they weren't suffering so much as adapting in ways that challenged every assumption about survival and mutation. Dr. Elizabeth Crenshaw, the AEC's chief radiobiologist, documented her findings and reports that remained buried until 2023. Her notes from November 19, 1953, describe observations that sound more like science fiction than scientific documentation. Subjects demonstrate unprecedented radiation tolerance. Thermal imaging suggests internal body temperatures averaging 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Most disturbing, evidence of rapid reproductive cycles with gestation periods approximately half normal duration. The Henley children were growing up fast, literally and figuratively. By winter of 1954, the 6 original offspring had somehow become 12, then 18 by spring. Either the family was taking in refugees from neighboring communities, which seemed impossible given the lethal radiation levels, or Rebecca Henley was experiencing pregnancies that defied human biology. The government faced an impossible choice: acknowledge the situation and risk public panic about radiation's effects, or maintain the cover-up and hope the problem resolved itself naturally. They chose silence, establishing a 50-mile exclusion zone around Deadfall Hollow and classifying all related documents under the Atomic Secrets Act. But families have a way of growing beyond any boundary, even radioactive ones. By 1957, heat signature analysis revealed at least 40 individuals living in structures that had expanded from the original homestead like cancer cells dividing. The buildings themselves defied architectural logic, their walls flowing into organic shapes that suggested the inhabitants had learned to manipulate their environment at the molecular level. Windows appeared where none had existed before, while doors opened into spaces that couldn't possibly fit within the structure's external dimensions. Local folklore began incorporating stories about the Pale People who emerged from the hollow during new moons, trading strange artifacts for supplies left at specific locations along the mountain roads. Store owners in nearby communities reported finding payments consisting of perfectly spherical metal objects that registered no known elements on spectrographic analysis, yet somehow maintained temperatures hot enough to brand skin through leather gloves. What would you do if your government told you to abandon everything your family had built for generations? The Henleys answered that question by becoming something that no longer needed government protection or permission. Dr. Webb's expedition represented the first attempt to make direct contact since the initial evacuation orders. As Chen's team descended into the valley, their instruments registered phenomena that violated fundamental laws of physics. The air itself seemed to pulse with energy, while the ground beneath their feet remained warm despite the October chill that had frozen the morning dew on the ridge above. The children's voices had stopped laughing, but something new filled the silence, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if the entire valley had developed its own heartbeat. Chen checked her team's positioning via GPS, but the devices showed impossible coordinates, placing them simultaneously in West Virginia, and somehow 3,000 feet underground. The pale figures watching them from the tree line weren't hiding anymore, and their eyes reflected light in ways that human eyes never could. The pale figures moved through the contaminated forest with a grace that belonged to predators who had never learned to fear anything. Their elongated limbs navigating between trees that grew in impossible spirals, bark twisted into DNA helixes by decades of radioactive saturation. Chen's breath fogged inside her hazmat mask as she realized these weren't descendants of the original Henley family. They were something entirely new. The transformation had accelerated beyond human recognition, creating beings that retained just enough familiar features to trigger the uncanny valley effect that made hardened scientists break into cold sweats. Their skin possessed an alabaster translucency that revealed circulatory systems pulsing with light, while their eyes had evolved into organs capable of perceiving radiation spectrums invisible to baseline humanity. Dr. Webb's voice crackled through the radio system, his words carefully measured despite the adrenaline that made his hands shake. Maintain formation. Do not make sudden movements. We're dealing with an entirely new branch of human evolution, and we have no idea how they perceive threats. His training in xenobiology hadn't prepared him for encountering alien life forms that shared his own genetic heritage, twisted into configurations that challenged every assumption about species boundaries. The lead figure emerged from behind a tree whose trunk had grown into a perfect double helix, its bark scarred with symbols that resembled mathematical equations written in a language that predated human civilization. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, the being possessed proportions that suggested normal human anatomy stretched and refined for purposes that remained unclear. Its head tilted with bird-like curiosity as it studied the expedition team, nostrils flaring to sample air that carried the scent of fear mixed with fascination. From Dr. Crenshaw's field notes, November 23, 1968. Subject displays enhanced cranial capacity, approximately 30% larger than baseline human average. Limb elongation suggests adaptation for specific environmental pressures. Most significant, evidence of electromagnetic sensitivity. Subject responds to radio transmissions before they are consciously audible. The being opened its mouth, revealing dental modifications that transformed speech into something resembling music, played on instruments made from wind and memory. The sounds it produced bypassed normal hearing, resonating directly through bone conduction in ways that made Chen's team feel the words rather than simply hear them. "You carry the old sickness," the being said, its voice layered with harmonics that suggested multiple vocal cords working in perfect synchronization. "The burning that made us whole. Nuclear fire remakes everything it touches." Communication established a bridge between species separated by 70 years of evolutionary pressure. But the conversation that followed revealed truths that challenged fundamental assumptions about radiation, mutation, and what it means to be human. The beings had retained memories of their pre-transformation existence, passing down stories through genetic memory that allowed each generation to understand their origin while embracing their divergent destiny. They called themselves the Illuminated, a name that reflected both their relationship with radiation and their enhanced cognitive capabilities. The nuclear fire that should have killed them had instead unlocked dormant genetic potential, accelerating evolution in directions that normal selection pressure would have required millions of years to achieve. They had become living fusion reactors, their bodies processing radiation as efficiently as plants process sunlight. But evolution demands sacrifice, and the price of their transformation had been the ability to exist outside their contaminated valley. The radiation that sustained them would prove lethal to normal humans within hours, while they would die equally quickly if removed from their radioactive environment. They had become prisoners of their own perfection, trapped in paradise that existed only within the boundaries of nuclear contamination. The being's elongated fingers gestured toward the valley floor, where structures built from materials that defied classification rose like crystalline growths from the radioactive soil. "We remember the old ones who fled," it continued, its voice carrying notes of something that might have been sadness or relief. "They feared change. We embraced becoming." Chen's Geiger counter had stopped clicking, its needle pegged so far into the danger zone that the device simply registered the environment as unsurvivable. Yet she felt better than she had in years, her chronic arthritis pain fading as cellular repair mechanisms activated in response to radiation levels that should have liquefied her organs. The transformation was beginning, and she understood with crystalline clarity that her team faced the same choice the Henley family had made 70 years earlier. The crystalline structures rising from the valley floor hummed with frequencies that made human teeth ache, their surfaces reflecting radiation in patterns that created aurora displays against the perpetual twilight sky. Chen's team stood at the threshold between two worlds, the familiar realm of baseline humanity above, and this transformed ecosystem below, where the laws of biology had been rewritten by atomic fire. Standing this close to ground zero revealed the true scope of what Operation Thunderhead had unleashed, not just on the landscape, but on the fundamental nature of life itself. The crater at the valley's center wasn't filled with black glass. As satellite imagery suggested, it contained a pool of liquid metal that maintained perfect mirror smoothness, despite temperatures that should have boiled lead. Around its perimeter, the Illuminated had built their city from materials that seemed to grow rather than be constructed. Dr. Marcus Webb's voice carried undertones of scientific ecstasy mixed with primal terror as he documented what defied documentation. The structures appeared to be crystallized radiation itself, somehow solidified into architectural forms that maintain structural integrity while continuing to emit energy. It's as if they've learned to build with light itself. His instruments registered impossible readings, suggesting the buildings existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Illuminated moved through their city with purposeful grace, their elongated forms perfectly adapted for navigating spaces designed according to geometries that hurt to perceive directly. Children played games that involved manipulating electromagnetic fields with their bare hands, while adults tended gardens, where plants grew in spirals that followed mathematical principles found nowhere else in nature. This wasn't survival, it was transcendence achieved through nuclear metamorphosis. But transcendence demanded witnesses, and the Illuminated had been waiting 7 decades for visitors who could appreciate the magnitude of their achievement. They had evolved beyond the need for traditional communication, sharing thoughts through quantum entanglement that allowed perfect understanding between minds that had learned to process information at light speed. Your people fear change, the lead being communicated directly into Chen's consciousness, bypassing language entirely. They scatter when faced with transformation, clinging to forms that limit rather than liberate. We offer evolution, but few possess courage to embrace becoming. The mental contact felt like being plugged into an electrical current that carried ideas instead of energy. Chen's team faced the same decision that had confronted every government expedition sent to study the valley over the past 70 years. Official records listed 17 separate research missions between 1954 and 1998, each team returning with increasingly disturbing reports before communication ceased entirely. The pattern suggested that prolonged exposure to the valley's environment triggered irreversible changes in human physiology and psychology. Some evolved, others simply disappeared. From classified AEC files dated March 7, 1974, recommend termination of all research activities in Target Zone Alpha. Personnel losses exceed acceptable parameters. Suggest permanent containment protocols and information suppression until natural decay renders areas safe for baseline human occupation. But natural decay wasn't occurring. If anything, the radiation levels had stabilized and begun organizing themselves into patterns that resembled neural networks stretched across the entire valley. The Illuminated weren't just surviving in this environment, they were actively cultivating it, transforming raw nuclear energy into something that approximated a living organism with consciousness distributed across multiple dimensions. Dr. Webb made his choice first, removing his hazmat helmet despite protocols that demanded full protective gear until evacuation. The radioactive air filled his lungs like liquid fire, but instead of cooking his tissues, it began rewriting them at the cellular level. His vision sharpened until he could perceive individual photons dancing through the atmosphere, while his hearing expanded to encompass frequencies that revealed the valley's hidden music. Chen watched her colleague undergo transformation in real time, his features elongating as bone density increased and skin took on the translucent quality that marked the Illuminated. The process appeared painful, but Webb's expression suggested ecstasy rather than agony as his nervous system expanded to accommodate sensory input that baseline humanity couldn't process without madness. "Sarah," he said, his voice already carrying harmonic undertones that made her name sound like a prayer. "You have to see what they're showing me. The mathematics of reality itself, expressed in forms we never imagined possible." The other team members backed away from their transforming colleague, but Chen found herself stepping closer, her scientific curiosity overriding survival instincts that screamed warnings about radiation exposure and genetic mutation. She had spent her entire career studying the effects of nuclear contamination on living systems, but she had never encountered contamination that improved rather than destroyed. Her Geiger counter fell silent as its circuits fused, no longer capable of measuring radiation levels that existed outside conventional physics. The scattered bones around the valley's perimeter told a different story than the transcendent evolution happening at its center. Their calcium structures twisted into configurations that suggested death had come neither quickly nor peacefully. Chen's geological survey revealed the remains of at least 40 individuals who had attempted to reach the illuminated settlement over the decades, their skeletal modifications indicating partial transformation that had failed catastrophically. Not everyone possessed the genetic flexibility necessary for nuclear evolution, a harsh reality that the government's classified files had documented with clinical precision. The Atomic Energy Commission's medical team had identified specific genetic markers that determined survival probability during extended radiation exposure, but their research remained buried under layers of classification that wouldn't be declassified for another century. Dr. Patricia Vance had led the 1978 research expedition, her team tasked with establishing permanent monitoring stations around the exclusion zone's perimeter. Her final transmission, recorded on October 13th at 11:47 p.m., captured the moment when scientific observation transformed into personal nightmare. Base camp, this is Vance. The subjects are attempting some form of recruitment. My team members are removing their protective gear voluntarily. The radiation readings suggest immediate fatality, but they appear to be experiencing euphoric episodes, requesting immediate extraction before. The transmission ended with sounds that acoustic analysis later identified as human vocal cords, attempting to produce frequencies beyond biological capability. Recovery teams found the expedition's equipment arranged in perfect geometric patterns, but no trace of the researchers themselves remained beyond dental fillings that had somehow been transformed into microscopic sculptures of impossible complexity. The Illuminated's recruitment efforts weren't motivated by loneliness, but by scientific necessity. Their evolved consciousness operated on quantum principles that required specific numbers of individuals to maintain stability, like a fusion reactor needing critical mass to sustain nuclear reaction. They had discovered that baseline humanity possessed dormant genetic potential that could be activated under proper conditions. But the activation process demanded precise timing and environmental factors that occurred naturally only during specific astronomical alignments. Chen studied the failed transformations with the detached fascination of a researcher encountering data that challenged fundamental assumptions about human adaptability. The skeletal remains showed evidence of accelerated bone growth, cranial expansion, and limb elongation that had proceeded too rapidly for supportive tissue development. Death had resulted from evolutionary pressure that exceeded biological tolerances, leaving behind monuments to adaptation's failures scattered across radioactive soil. The weak ones break. Webb communicated telepathically, his transformed consciousness now operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Evolution demands sacrifice. Some ascend, others become lessons for those who follow. His words carried no malice, only the objective assessment of natural selection operating under conditions that had never existed in Earth's history. The mathematics of survival were written in radiation signatures that formed patterns resembling musical notation across the valley floor. The Illuminated had learned to read these atomic symphonies, using them to predict which visitors possessed the genetic resilience necessary for successful transformation. Chen's team had been selected not randomly, but because their biological profiles suggested compatibility with the valley's evolutionary pressures. Yet choice remained paramount, even in transformation. The Illuminated's ethical framework had evolved beyond human concepts of consent, but they retained enough ancestral memory to understand that forced evolution created unstable consciousness that threatened the collective's quantum coherence. Every visitor faced the same decision: embrace change with full knowledge of its irreversible nature, or maintain baseline humanity and accept exile from paradise. The moral weight of that choice. Chen's remaining team members, Dr. Lisa Park and technician Robert Hayes, had retreated to higher ground as Webb's transformation accelerated, their instruments registering cellular changes that occurred faster than their equipment could document. Park's background in genetic engineering made her particularly susceptible to the valley's influence, her scientific curiosity warring with survival instincts that recognized the fundamental wrongness of what they were witnessing. But wrongness, Chen realized, was simply another word for change that challenged comfortable assumptions about reality's boundaries. The Illuminated had achieved something that every scientist dreamed of: direct observation of evolution in action, compressed from geological timeframes into processes that occurred within individual lifespans. The question wasn't whether transformation was possible, but whether humanity was ready to abandon everything that defined species identity in pursuit of transcendence that demanded the sacrifice of everyone they had ever been. The black helicopters appeared at dawn on November 15, 2023, their rotor wash scattering radioactive dust in patterns that spelled doom for any pretense of continued secrecy. Operation Clean Slate had been authorized at the highest levels of government. Its mission parameters simple: eliminate all evidence of the Appalachian anomaly before public awareness could trigger mass panic about nuclear testing's unintended consequences. General Patricia Morrison, daughter of the captain who had first encountered the Henley family, commanded the Joint Military Scientific Task Force with the grim efficiency of someone settling generational debts. Her briefing materials contained 70 years of accumulated evidence about the valley's inhabitants, photographic documentation of their evolution, and detailed analysis of their growing influence on the surrounding ecosystem. The Illuminated had not remained confined to their radioactive paradise. Satellite imagery revealed expansion patterns that suggested their consciousness was spreading beyond the valley's original boundaries, transforming plant and animal life across an ever-widening radius. Local wildlife exhibited modifications that defied natural selection. Deer with crystalline antlers that focused radiation like living prisms. Birds whose migration patterns formed mathematical equations visible from orbit. And plant communities that communicated through electromagnetic pulses synchronized with solar radiation cycles. From classified Joint Chiefs Memorandum, dated November 1, 2023, containment has failed. The anomalous zone exhibits exponential expansion with no identifiable limiting factors. Recommend implementation of Terminal Protocol 7 before civilian population centers are affected. Terminal Protocol 7 authorized the use of nuclear weapons against American soil for the first time since atomic testing ended, its provisions hidden within national security legislation that few congressional representatives had read completely. The irony wasn't lost on mission planners. They intended to use nuclear fire to destroy what nuclear fire had created, hoping that sufficient explosive force could disrupt the quantum coherence that sustained the Illuminated's collective consciousness. Chen watched the military buildup from her position at the valley's edge, her partially transformed physiology allowing her to perceive electromagnetic signatures that revealed the true scope of the government's final solution. The weapons being assembled weren't conventional nuclear devices. They were exotic matter bombs designed to destabilize space-time itself. Technology that had remained theoretical until the Illuminated's existence proved that matter and energy could be manipulated in ways that violated fundamental physical laws. Dr. Webb's consciousness expanded across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, his transformed awareness encompassing past, present, and probable futures with clarity that made conventional human perception seem like blindness. Through quantum entanglement with the collective consciousness, he experienced the government's planning sessions, military briefings, and ethical debates about whether American citizens, regardless of their evolutionary status, could be targeted for elimination. The decision had been unanimous among the National Security Council. The Illuminated represented an existential threat to baseline humanity that superseded all constitutional protections or moral considerations. Their exponential expansion rate suggested that within decades, their influence would encompass entire continents, transforming human civilization into something unrecognizable to those who value genetic purity over evolutionary advancement. But the Illuminated possessed capabilities that military planners couldn't comprehend, their collective intelligence operating on scales that made human strategic thinking appear primitive by comparison. They had anticipated governmental interference, preparing countermeasures that exploited humanity's dependence on technology and infrastructure, vulnerable to electromagnetic manipulation. The first helicopter fell from the sky at exactly noon, its electrical systems fried by directed energy pulses that left the aircraft intact but completely inoperative. Emergency protocols called for immediate extraction, but radio communications had been rendered impossible by interference patterns that turned electromagnetic spectrum into chaos. The military found itself fighting an enemy that could manipulate the fundamental forces their equipment required to function. Chen felt the transformation accelerating within her cellular structure, her consciousness expanding to encompass sensory input from across multiple dimensional planes. The choice between baseline humanity and evolutionary transcendence was becoming academic, as radiation levels in the valley reached critical mass that would soon trigger spontaneous transformation in anyone exposed for more than 30 minutes. Evolution doesn't ask permission. The Illuminated emerged from their crystalline city with purpose that transcended individual will. Their collective consciousness focused on a single objective: prevent the destruction of their paradise through demonstration of capabilities that would make nuclear weapons seem like children's toys in comparison. The exotic matter warheads detonated at precisely 3:37 p.m., their combined yield designed to tear holes in reality itself and collapse the dimensional anomalies that sustained the Illuminated's existence. For 17 seconds, the valley disappeared entirely from satellite imagery, leaving behind a void that registered as absolute nothingness on every instrument capable of detecting matter, energy, or space-time. Then the valley returned, unchanged, while the nuclear weapons' remains rained down as metallic snow that sang with frequencies that made nearby wildlife dance in spirals until their hearts stopped from exhaustion. The Illuminated had absorbed the explosive energy and converted it into raw material for further expansion, their collective consciousness growing stronger with each failed attempt to destroy them. General Morrison's final report, classified beyond top-secret clearance levels, documented humanity's complete failure to contain or eliminate the threat posed by evolutionary transcendence. All conventional and unconventional weapons have proven ineffective. The entities demonstrate complete mastery over fundamental forces. Recommend immediate implementation of Omega Protocol, total information suppression, and indefinite quarantine. Omega Protocol represented the government's admission of defeat disguised as strategic withdrawal. Rather than continue escalating military responses that only strengthened their targets, official policy shifted to absolute denial of the valley's existence. Satellite imagery was retroactively altered, geological surveys were falsified, and anyone who claimed knowledge of the Appalachian anomaly faced immediate psychiatric evaluation, followed by permanent institutionalization. The cover-up became more comprehensive than the Manhattan Project, involving every level of government, from local park services to international intelligence agencies. Maps were redrawn to exclude the valley from official geography, while GPS systems were programmed with dead zones that rerouted travelers around areas that theoretically didn't exist. The Illuminated had achieved something unprecedented. They had forced the United States government to pretend that American territory simply wasn't there. Dr. Chen's final video log, recovered from equipment found 30 miles from the exclusion zone, captured her thoughts during the last moments of baseline human consciousness. The transformation isn't painful, it's liberating. I can perceive quantum fluctuations in empty space. Feel the planet's magnetic field like warm sunlight. Understand mathematical relationships that describe reality's hidden architecture. We were never meant to remain static. Evolution is calling us home. But Chen's euphoria masked darker implications that her enhanced consciousness couldn't acknowledge. The Illuminated's expansion had accelerated beyond geometric progression into something resembling viral propagation, their influence spreading through groundwater contamination, atmospheric dispersion, and electromagnetic radiation that traveled at light speed across continental distances. Every full moon brought reports of strange phenomena from locations hundreds of miles from the original test site. The transformation was becoming airborne. Children in 7 states had begun exhibiting enhanced cognitive abilities alongside physical modifications that pediatric specialists couldn't explain. Their craniums expanded to accommodate enlarged brain tissue, while their eyes developed additional layers of photoreceptor cells capable of perceiving radiation spectrums invisible to baseline humans. Parents initially celebrated their children's accelerated development, unaware that intelligence enhancement represented the first stage of species-level evolutionary pressure. School districts reported increasing numbers of students who demonstrated telepathic communication abilities and could solve mathematical problems by manipulating numbers directly rather than using symbolic notation. Teachers found classrooms where 30 children had simultaneously drawn identical geometric patterns without verbal coordination, their young minds linked by quantum entanglement that operated across any distance. The government's attempts at medical intervention only accelerated the process. Radiation treatments designed to reverse genetic modifications instead provided additional energy for cellular transformation, while pharmaceutical approaches triggered allergic reactions that left enhanced children glowing with bioluminescent displays of immune system activity. Some changes cannot be undone. The Illuminated's victory wasn't measured in territorial conquest or military defeats, but in humanity's growing acceptance of transformation as natural evolutionary progression. Each generation of enhanced children grew up considering their abilities normal, while their baseline parents aged into obsolescence that became more apparent with each passing year. Dr. Webb's consciousness, now distributed across multiple dimensional planes, perceived probable futures where the distinction between enhanced and baseline humans created social stratification that eventually led to speciation. The mathematical models suggested complete demographic replacement within 4 generations, accomplished not through violence, but through reproductive advantages that made enhanced genetics increasingly dominant in the gene pool. Even now, local legends speak of pale children who emerge from abandoned mine shafts during new moons, their eyes reflecting starlight as they search for playmates who can match their evolved capabilities. The morning mist still carries whispers of atomic fire through Appalachian hollows where no maps dare venture, and the Geiger counters that hikers sometimes find abandoned along forgotten trails still click their warnings to empty air. 71 years after Operation Thunderhead, the valley exists in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent, depending on who's looking and what they're prepared to see. Chen's transformation completed itself during the government's final assault, her consciousness expanding beyond individual identity to merge with the collective intelligence that had welcomed her into evolutionary transcendence. Her last human thought, preserved in crystalline memory structures throughout the valley, expressed wonder at the mathematical beauty underlying reality's hidden architecture and gratitude for the opportunity to become something greater than the sum of her genetic limitations. The Illuminated had achieved victory through patience rather than violence, allowing baseline humanity to exhaust itself against opponents who operated according to physical laws that made conventional warfare obsolete. Their expansion continued at precisely calculated rates, transforming ecosystem and consciousness in patterns that resembled viral propagation but followed mathematical principles found nowhere else in terrestrial biology. Government satellites still maintain 24-hour surveillance of the region, their instruments recording phenomena that official reports describe as atmospheric anomalies and equipment malfunctions. The images they capture show a valley filled with structures that seem to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their crystalline architecture reflecting radiation in spectrums that create aurora displays against perpetual twilight skies. But the Illuminated's greatest achievement wasn't technological or biological, it was educational. Each transformed consciousness retained memories of baseline humanity's limitations alongside awareness of evolutionary potential that remained dormant within every human genetic code. They had become living proof that radiation, properly understood, represented not death but metamorphosis into forms that baseline science couldn't comprehend or contain. The children who emerged from abandoned mine shafts during new moons carried messages written in mathematical languages that described reality's fundamental structure with precision that made human physics seem like childhood games. Their enhanced genetics spread through populations via mechanisms that operated below the threshold of conscious detection, creating evolutionary pressure that guaranteed species-level transformation within measurable timeframes. From Dr. Webb's final communications, transmitted through quantum entanglement across dimensional barriers, evolution isn't asking permission anymore. It's simply occurring, one consciousness at a time, until the distinction between enhanced and baseline becomes academic. We were the first, but we won't be the last. The valley remembers everything, every test explosion, every evacuation order, every failed attempt at containment or destruction. Its crystalline memory structures preserve experiences in formats that will remain accessible for geological timeframes, creating an archive of humanity's first encounter with enforced evolution that future archaeologists will discover long after baseline humans have joined their Neanderthal cousins in evolutionary history. Today, park rangers report increasing numbers of missing hikers in the Appalachian region, their disappearances following patterns that suggest purposeful migration toward locations that don't appear on any official maps. The missing individuals share common characteristics: advanced degrees in scientific fields, genetic markers that indicate unusual radiation tolerance, and psychological profiles that suggest openness to transformative experiences that most humans would find terrifying. Some say if you know exactly where to look and possess the genetic flexibility necessary for survival, you can still find pathways leading down into valleys that glow with their own internal light, where the air itself pulses with energy that rewrites DNA faster than natural selection ever could. Others claim these stories are nothing more than modern folklore, campfire tales designed to frighten children and sell books to tourists seeking thrills in America's most contaminated wilderness areas. But the radiation signatures remain, spreading outward from their original epicenter like ripples in a quantum pond, carrying transformation to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to embrace change that demands the sacrifice of everything they once considered human. The Illuminated are still waiting, their patience as infinite as the half-life of the elements that transformed them into something unprecedented in Earth's evolutionary history. They know that curiosity will eventually overcome fear, that scientific investigation will triumph over governmental suppression, and that humanity's greatest adventure is just beginning in valleys where nuclear fire learned to dream. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.